Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett stood beneath the sharp glare of CNN's studio lights, her maroon suit catching every glint of the camera as the countdown to live broadcast began. The air was electric, anticipation thick enough to feel. She was about to face one of America's most formidable legal legends. Across the stage, Alan Dershowitz, the 85-year-old Harvard law professor emeritus and celebrated defense attorney, strode forward with unshakable confidence. In his hand was a stack of papers, annotated and thick with highlights. "I have documentation," he told the moderator, his voice steady, polished by decades of courtroom command. "Proof that exposes the Congresswoman's fundamental misunderstanding of constitutional law." He glanced toward Crockett with a faint smirk. "She may be the new darling of the Democratic Party," he continued, "but tonight the public will see she's hopelessly out of her depth." A murmur rippled through the live audience. Phones lifted. The crowd sensed a clash worth recording. The stage was set for a generational showdown, old power versus new conviction. Dershowitz, with his Harvard pedigree and courtroom triumphs, looked every bit the heavyweight. But Crockett, a former civil rights lawyer and public defender, stood her ground, calm and centered. Her gaze met his squarely, the quiet steadiness of someone who'd faced tougher fights in smaller rooms. To those who knew her, the look in her eyes said it all. This wasn't just a debate, it was a reckoning. As CNN's anchor, Rebecca Mitchell, began the segment on voting rights legislation, tension pulsed through the studio. Neither Crockett nor Dershowitz blinked. Viewers at home could feel the gravity of what was about to unfold. Before the debate fully began, Rebecca turned to camera. "Before we dive in," she said smoothly, "remember to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for our deep dive coverage. Tonight's discussion on the Voting Rights Protection Act is one you won't want to miss." She pivoted to the guests. Joining us tonight, Harvard Law Professor Emeritus Alan Dershowitz, known for representing some of America's most high-profile clients, and Texas Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, a rising star and co-sponsor of the Voting Rights Protection Act. Dershowitz nodded first. Impeccably dressed in a navy suit and crisp tie, his silver hair gleamed under the lights. "Thank you, Rebecca," he began, voice carrying the faint Boston edge that had once echoed through Ivy League halls. "I've been teaching constitutional law since before the Congresswoman was born. I think Americans deserve to hear from someone who truly understands the Constitution." The condescension was barely veiled. He raised his stack of papers like a badge of authority, every page marked, every line rehearsed. Across from him, Crockett adjusted her gold necklace and leaned slightly forward. At 43, the Yale-educated attorney had spent years in courtrooms defending working families and voters before stepping into Congress. Her poise was effortless, her composure deliberate. "Good evening," she began, her tone warm but firm, the trace of her Texas roots grounding every word. "Unlike some, I'm not here to lecture from an ivory tower. I'm here to talk about how this legislation protects the real people I've served, in court and now in Congress." Rebecca smiled, sensing the undercurrent. "Let's begin," she said. "Professor Dershowitz, you've called this bill unconstitutional. Congresswoman Crockett, you're a co-sponsor. What's truly at stake?" Before she could respond, Dershowitz interjected. "What's at stake," he snapped, "is the balance of power. Congress is overreaching, plain and simple. The Constitution grants states, not Washington, control over elections. Frankly, I'm surprised someone with a law degree would support such an unconstitutional power grab." A faint smile touched Crockett's lips. Not amusement, recognition. She'd seen this playbook before, men with titles mistaking arrogance for authority. Her team had prepared for this. They'd studied Dershowitz's style, the interruptions, the superiority complex, the reliance on legacy over logic. What he didn't know was that she had spent the weekend poring over his own writings from the 1970s and 80s, essays that contradicted his stance entirely. She'd even spoken with a few of his former students, learning exactly how he crumbled under quiet precision. In the control room, CNN producers leaned forward. They knew they were watching television gold. For Dershowitz, this debate was about legacy. For Crockett, it was about lineage, a new generation of legal minds proving they belonged at the same table. Rebecca turned back. "Congresswoman Crockett," she said, "your response?" Crockett straightened her notes and spoke with surgical calm. "Let's start with something simple," she said. "Constitutional interpretation isn't the private property of Ivy League professors. It belongs to every American whose rights depend on it." Dershowitz raised an eyebrow, ready to interrupt, but Crockett pressed on. "The professor claims I misunderstand the Constitution. Let's look at the text. Article 1, Section 4 clearly gives Congress authority over federal elections. The 14th and 15th Amendments reaffirm that power, explicitly to protect voting rights. That's not theory. That's the law." The studio fell silent. Crockett had flipped the script, transforming his lecture into her master class. Dershowitz's jaw tightened. "I'm well aware of those sections," he said sharply. "But the Supreme Court has repeatedly upheld state control over elections. Shelby County versus Holder, for example." "I'm very familiar with Shelby County," Crockett replied smoothly. "I've personally litigated cases affected by that decision. The issue isn't whether states have authority. It's whether they abuse it to silence voters." The professor frowned. "That's exactly the kind of emotional rhetoric that clouds serious debate. The Constitution promises equal protection, not convenience." Crockett's voice didn't rise, but her words struck like a hammer. "When voting restrictions consistently target certain communities," she said, "that's not convenience. That's constitutional harm." Rebecca intervened before the tension could combust. "Let's move to specifics," she said quickly. "Professor, you've criticized the section mandating early voting days. Why?" Dershowitz seized the opening. "Because this," he said, tapping his notes, "is overreach. States differ. Populations differ. Washington imposing one-size-fits-all rules ignores that diversity. It's federalism turned upside down. I have testimony from election officials in 17 states warning that these mandates would cause chaos." He paused, eyes gleaming. "The Congresswoman is prioritizing ideology over practicality." Crockett opened a folder, unfazed. "That's interesting," she said, "because I have letters from 23 states, and including several Republican-led, supporting these same standards as both achievable and necessary." Then she looked him dead in the eye. "But let's talk about consistency. In your 1982 book, Rights of the People, you wrote, and I quote, 'Federal voting standards may be essential when states repeatedly discriminate or fail administratively.' You even endorsed national early voting requirements." "Tell me, Professor, has the Constitution changed since then, or just your opinion?" The camera zoomed in. For a split second, Dershowitz faltered. He cleared his throat. "Academic thought evolves with time and evidence," he said stiffly. "The landscape today is not what it was in the 80s. Crockett nodded slowly. "So your interpretation of the Constitution changes with political weather. That's an interesting position for someone who calls himself an originalist." The audience reacted audibly, a mix of gasps and applause. Rebecca stepped in again. "Let's pivot to voter ID laws. Congresswoman, critics argue that limiting ID requirements weakens election integrity." Crockett replied without missing a beat. "Those critics ignore the data. Study after study, including from the Brennan Center for Justice, shows that voter impersonation is practically non-existent. What's real is that over 25 million Americans lack the specific IDs some states now demand," Dershowitz scoffed. "The Brennan Center isn't neutral, and it's absurd to suggest Americans can't obtain identification. It's patronizing, frankly." A flicker of restrained anger crossed Crockett's face. Her voice stayed steady, but each word cut clean. "Professor," she said softly, "have you ever represented someone who lost their vote because they couldn't afford the paperwork for an ID?" "I have." "Have you met elderly citizens born with midwives who never had birth certificates?" "I have." "Have you spoken to workers who can't take unpaid hours to visit government offices open only during their shifts?" "I have." She leaned slightly forward. "Calling these barriers insulting proves exactly what I said earlier. The ivory tower disconnect." The studio was silent again, but this time, no one doubted who truly understood the Constitution that night. Dershowitz leaned back, realizing he was losing control of the conversation. Your anecdotes may be moving, he said tersely, but they don't override the constitutional authority of states to preserve election integrity. The Supreme Court has repeatedly upheld reasonable ID requirements. Crockett leaned in slightly. Then let's talk about the Supreme Court. She countered in Crawford versus Marion County. The court upheld Indiana's voter ID law. Yes, but it also made clear that the ruling was based on limited evidence of voter burden. When solid evidence shows disenfranchisement, the constitutional balance changes. She held up another document. And since we're quoting past work in your own 2005 Harvard Law Review article, you criticize judges who disguise policy preferences behind constitutional language. You specifically cited voter ID laws as examples where fraud prevention is used as a political smokescreen. Durowitz bristled. You're taking that completely out of context. Am I? Crockett shot back, raising an eyebrow. Would you like me to read the rest? I have the full passage right here. Rebecca quickly intervened, sensing the perfect cliffhanger for viewers. We need to pause for a short break, she said with a smile. When we return, the debate over voting rights continues, and we'll take live questions from our audience. As the cameras cut, Dershowitz leaned toward Hysayed, whispering furiously while pointing to his notes. Something had clearly gone wrong. His assistant flipped through pages, searching for support. Across Thedable, Crockett remained calm, sipping her water. A producer approached, asking if she needed anything. I'm fine, she said softly. But you might want to check on the professor. We haven't even gotten to the most interesting contradictions yet. When the broadcast resumed, the tone was different. Dershowitz had regrouped, his jaw set, eyes sharp. He turned to the host. During the break, I reviewed my actual writings, not the Congresswoman's selective quotes. My position has always been clear. Voting regulations must balance access with integrity. That's what the states are doing. He looked straight at Jasmine Crockett, determined to reclaim control. Durowitz leaned back, adjusting his glasses, his irritation now visible. Since the Congresswoman wants to compare credentials, he said, his tone dripping with superiority. Let's be transparent. I've argued more than 50 cases before the U.S. Supreme Court. I've taught constitutional law to thousands of this country's most accomplished attorneys. With all due respect, your brief background as a state legislator and first-term member of Congress hardly qualifies you to lecture me about constitutional interpretation. The condescension in his voice echoed through the studio, exactly what Jasmine Crockett had been anticipating. She straightened slightly, her expression calm but unyielding. Professor, she began, her tone crisp and deliberate, I think it's time we acknowledge the elephant in the room. Her words cut through the air like a blade. The elephant in the room, Crockett continued. Is that you're leaning on your resume instead of responding to my legal arguments? That tactic might work in a classroom where students are afraid to challenge you, but this isn't Harvard Law, and I'm not one of your students. A brief murmur rippled through the audience. Durowitz's face stiffened. I am addressing substance, he said defensively. You're the one fixated on decades-old quotes. I'm highlighting the evolution of your opinions, Crockett countered. But let's stick to today's debate. You've argued that states should have broad discretion over election laws. Yet in December 2020, you publicly claimed that state legislatures were not even bound by their own state constitutions when appointing presidential electors, a stance that could have voided millions of votes. She lifted another document from her stack. Your own words, Professor. You wrote, and I quote, "The Constitution assigns this power to state legislators, not the states generally. How do you reconcile that with your newfound defense of federalism?" The veteran lawyer shifted in his seat, clearly uneasy. That was a very specific legal argument about the electors clause, completely different from general voting regulations. Is it? Crockett pressed, eyes locked on him. Both issues deal with the same constitutional principles, respect for federalism and protection of the fundamental right to vote. Yet your positions seem to depend less on consistent interpretation and more on which political outcome they support. A murmur swept through the live audience. Dershowitz's face flushed red. That's an outrageous claim, he snapped. My positions are guided by rigorous constitutional reasoning, not politics. Crockett nodded slowly, her expression calm but pointed. Then let's examine that reasoning. You've repeatedly cited Shelby County v. Holder to justify reducing federal oversight of state election laws. But even in that decision, Chief Justice Roberts affirmed that Congress still retains broad authority to address voting discrimination authority this bill exercises. And here's the difference, Professor. I've personally represented voters impacted by the fallout from Shelby County. I've seen polling places shut down in minority neighborhoods, voter roll purges that unfairly remove eligible citizens, and ID laws crafted with surgical precision to block the very communities they claim to protect. Durowitz tried to interrupt, but Crockett raised her hand firmly. Please, I listen to you without interruption. The professor hesitated, then stayed silent, perhaps recognizing the momentum had shifted. You mentioned your Supreme Court experience. Crockett continued, her voice steady. I respect that, but I've spent my career fighting for real people in state courts, helping elderly voters regain their rights and working families navigate bureaucratic barriers. Constitutional theory meets real life in those courtrooms, not just in academic debates. She picked up the Voting Rights Protection Act draft in front of her. This bill doesn't federalize all election procedures as you suggest. It sets minimum national standards to prevent voter suppression while leaving states plenty of flexibility in how they implement them. Rebecca Mitchell turned to Durowitz. Professor, your response? He cleared his throat, trying to steady his tone. The Congresswoman's experiences are touching, he said. But personal stories don't override the Constitution's framework. The fact remains, election administration rests primarily with the states. This bill goes beyond preventing discrimination and effectively micromanages local election systems. He lifted one of his documents dramatically. Section 306 alone contains 42 detailed federal mandates for early voting days and polling locations. That's not setting minimum standards. That's federal overreach. Crockett allowed herself a small, knowing smile. I'm glad you mentioned Section 306, Professor, she said, because that section was modeled after legislation you personally endorsed in your 1991 congressional testimony. At that time, you described similar provisions as appropriately tailored federal safeguards that respect state authority while ensuring fair access to the ballot. The entire studio went still. Crockett held up a printed transcript. This is from your testimony before the House Judiciary Committee dated March 14, 1991. Would you like me to read your full statement? Durowitz blinked rapidly, visibly rattled. I'd need to see the full context of that testimony, he muttered. Of course, Crockett replied calmly, sliding the paper across the table. Take your time? As he scanned, the documented camera zoomed in on his face. Viewers could see the transformation confidence melting into confusion and then quiet disbelief. The text matched exactly what she had quoted. Crockett turned to face the audience and cameras directly. This highlights a deeper issue, she said firmly. Too often, voting rights are treated as abstract legal theories rather than the real protections they are for everyday Americans. The same legal authorities who once defended federal voting protections now oppose them, not because the Constitution changed, but because the political winds did. Durowitz, scrambling to recover, straightened his notes. Even if I did support similar provisions back then, and I'd still like to verify that document's authenticity, the constitutional framework, Durowitz began, trying to recover his composure has evolved through later Supreme Court rulings. Crockett leaned forward slightly. Which rulings exactly, Professor? She asked with measured politeness. Because in Shelby County, the court made it clear that Congress still holds the authority to address voting discrimination. It merely required Congress to modernize the coverage formula for preclearance, and that's precisely what our bill does based on current data about discriminatory practices. She turned to Rebecca Mitchell, the moderator. Rebecca, this isn't an abstract constitutional question, Crockett continued. It's about whether we believe that every American, no matter their zip code, work hours, or physical ability, deserves equal access to the ballot box. The Constitution's text and history both affirm that Congress has a duty to act whenever that access is threatened. Now visibly uneasy, Durowitz shuffled through his papers. The Congresswoman is oversimplifying these complex constitutional questions, he said quickly. She's appealing to emotion rather than engaging in rigorous legal reasoning. Crockett arched an eyebrow. Am I? Then let's be specific about the law. She picked up the Constitution from her notes. Article 1, Section 4 states that the times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof, but the Congress may at any time by law make or alter such regulations. The text itself grants Congress final authority, she continued confidently. Furthermore, the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause and the 5th, 10th Amendment's prohibition on racial discrimination in voting both contain enforcement clauses giving Congress explicit power to pass legislation protecting those rights. The Supreme Court has reaffirmed this power repeatedly, most recently in Brnovich, DNC, which, while upholding certain Arizona laws, still reaffirmed Congress's constitutional authority to set national voting standards. The studio fell silent as Crockett methodically dismantled Durowitz's arguments. She cited case law, historical context, and specific sections of the bill with flawless precision. It was less a debate than a live masterclass in constitutional law delivered not from an ivory tower, but from someone who had lived the human consequences of those legal decisions. Each time Durowitz tried to interject, Crockett calmly parried with facts, leaving him increasingly frustrated. Finally, in what looked like a desperate attempt to regain control, he reached for what he thought was his winning argument. "Congresswoman, with all due respect," he said, his voice tightening, "I don't think you fully understand the unintended consequences of this bill. Section 52 could actually harm minority voters by diluting their representation in local elections." Crockett's smile widened slightly. "Professor, I'm afraid there's a small problem with that claim. There is no Section 5002 in this bill." The audience gasped. "The bill," she said calmly, "contains 428 sections in total." Durowitz froze, then began flipping frantically through his papers, realizing too late that he had confused this legislation with another. It was a devastating error for someone touting superior expertise. "I apologize for the mistake," he stammered, voice suddenly smaller. "I meant Section 4002, Crockett responded without missing a beat. "Section 4002 addresses ballot drop boxes, not minority vote dilution. Perhaps you're thinking of H.R. 2722 from the previous Congress. That's a completely different bill." The studio fell utterly silent again. It was themament that defined the entire exchange. Despite his towering resume, Dershowitz had walked into a debate, unprepared, relying on outdated talking points rather than the text before him. Crockett, on the other hand, knew the legislation line by line, having helped draft several of its provisions herself. Rebecca Mitchell turned toward Durowitz, sensing the weight of the moment. "Professor," she asked carefully after the Congresswoman's clarifications, "would you like to reconsider any part of your position on this bill?" Durowitz hesitated, his legendary confidence now visibly cracked. "I still have constitutional concerns," he admitted. "But I concede that some of my earlier criticisms may have been based on incomplete or outdated information. I'll need to review the current version more thoroughly." Crockett nodded respectfully. "I appreciate that acknowledgement, Professor," she said warmly. "I'd be happy to send your office a detailed breakdown of how each section aligns with existing constitutional precedent. Perhaps we can find common ground in protecting every American's right to vote." Her graciousness in victory only deepened the contrast between the two legal minds, one clinging to credentials, the other grounded in lived experience and precision. As the CNN segment wrapped, everyone watching understood they had just witnessed something extraordinary. A generational shift in America's legal and political discourse within minutes. Clips of Jasmine Crockett's takedown spread across social media. The most viral moment, her calmly exposing Durowitz for citing a non-existent section, 502, surged past 1 million views in less than an hour. Hashtags like "Mar Crockett Clapback" and "Wrong Section 502" trended nationwide. Political commentators quickly weighed in. Conservative analyst Andrew McCarthy tweeted, "Regardless of your stance on the bill, Crockett just delivered a masterclass in congressional preparation. Durowitz brought generalities, she brought receipts." On MSNBC, Rachel Maddow opened her show, saying, "We just witnessed the legal equivalent of David taking down Goliath, not with a slingshot, but with surgical precision." Behind the scenes, CNN producers who expected a dry policy debate were now racing to extend coverage. Overnight, they released a primetime special titled The New Defenders, Rising Voices Reshaping Legal Debate, featuring Crockett front and center. Meanwhile, in his Manhattan apartment, Alan Dershowitz faced one of the most humbling nights of his career. His phone buzzed nonstop with messages from journalists, colleagues, and former students. Harvard law message boards lit up with professors, noting how Crockett had turned the Socratic method once his greatest weapon back against him. By morning, Dershowitz released a brief statement. While I maintain my constitutional reservations about federal election laws, I fully acknowledge Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett's impressive command of the material and her thorough, respectful debate. It was a rare concession from a man unaccustomed to defeat and a defining moment for a congresswoman whose clarity, preparation, and conviction had just changed the tone of America's voting rights debate. Public debate thrives when all sides come prepared with strong arguments. Still, the official statement's diplomatic tone couldn't disguise what everyone recognized, an attempt at damage control for Jasmine Crockett. However, the aftermath was nothing short of transformative. Within hours, her congressional office overflowed with interview requests from every major network. Her social media following tripled overnight, and her inbox flooded with messages of support, recognizing her new national influence. House Democratic leaders invited her to lead a press conference on voting rights legislation the very next day. Even more striking, 3 representatives who had previously hesitated to support the bill reached out to her office, now pledging their votes. What had once seemed like a long-shot reform was suddenly gaining real momentum across legal circles. Their action was electric. Law professors, political analysts, and journalists dissected the debate from every angle. A Yale law scholar wrote, "Crockett proved that lived experience combined with legal expertise creates a deeper and more persuasive interpretation of the Constitution than theory alone." At Georgetown Law, a new forum was announced, Credentials versus Substance, Rethinking Legal Authority and Public Discourse. Inspired by the viral exchange, civil rights organizations like the NAACP and the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under Get Law issued public statements praising Crockett's arguments as reinforcing the constitutional foundation for federal voting protections. Meanwhile, voting rights advocates in Georgia, North Carolina, and Arizona reported major spikes in volunteer sign-ups for voter education and registration drives, with many citing Crockett's passionate defense as their motivation. On the other side of the political spectrum, conservative media scrambled to reframe the story. Fox News host Lavra Ingram argued that Crockett's gotcha moment over Section 5002 didn't change the core constitutional debate. Yet even on Fox, analysts admitted the obvious. Dershowitz had been outmatched on substance. He leaned on reputation, acknowledged former Judge Andrew Napolitano, while she leaned on preparation. 3 days after the viral CNN segment, an unexpected headline appeared. Alan Dershowitz requested a private meeting with Congresswoman Crockett at her Capitol Hill office, arriving alone. Without cameras or aides, the veteran attorney spoke with a tone far more measured than before. "Congresswoman," he began, "I have now reviewed the entire bill. While I still have concerns about some sections, I must acknowledge that your constitutional analysis was sound." He paused, then added quietly, "And your point about real-world impact that law without lived reality has limited value was well taken." Crockett's gracious evening victory suggested something unprecedented. "Professor, perhaps we could co-author an op-ed highlighting where we agree while acknowledging our differences. The American people deserve to see that constitutional interpretation doesn't have to be partisan." After a moment's reflection, Dershowitz agreed. Dr. and their joint piece, published in the Washington Post under the headline "Finding Constitutional Common Ground on Voting Rights," went viral once again, this time for showing intellectual cooperation instead of confrontation. It concluded powerfully. When debate centers on substance instead of status on evidence, instead of ego, democracy itself grows stronger. For Jasmine Crockett, the encounter marked not just a turning point in her career, but a transformation in how the nation viewed her leadership. Within a week, she received invitations to speak at Harvard Law, Yale, and Howard University. Law schools nationwide reported surging enrollment in voting rights courses for the next semester, but perhaps the most meaningful response came from thousands of young attorneys, law students, and women of color who wrote to thank her for her courage. "You showed us that we don't need to shrink ourselves or our experiences to face power," wrote one second-year law student from Michigan back in Washington. The political ripple effects continued. 3 Republican senators reached out to Crockett to explore bipartisan compromises on early voting standards. While major differences remained, the national discussion had clearly shifted from abstract theory to practical solutions, a field where Crockett thrived. At a Congressional Black Caucus meeting, veteran civil rights icon James Clern pulled her aside. "What you did wasn't just win a debate," he told her. "You changed the conversation for good. That's how real change begins." 6 weeks later, a revised version of the Voting Rights Protection Act passed the House with bipartisan support. Its Senate future was uncertain, but the bill now carried momentum that had once seemed impossible. Analysts credited Crockett's CNN performance for reshaping public understanding of both the constitutional principles and human realities behind voting access. In the broader media world, the Crockett-Dershowitz exchange became a landmark example in communications and law schools, a defining case study in how authority and public debate is shifting. Titles and credentials still mattered, but they no longer guaranteed dominance. What mattered most now was knowledge, preparation, and authenticity. For millions watching across America, the confrontation transcended partisanship. It wasn't just about law or politics. It was about who gets to speak with authority in a democracy, who gets to shape the national conversation, who gets to be heard. As for Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, reflecting with her staff one evening, she summed it up simply. "This was never about embarrassing Professor Dershowitz," she said quietly. "It was about making sure every citizen's right to vote is protected, not just in theory, but in practice. Because when legal theory meets lived reality, that's where justice truly begins." In classrooms and think tanks, the story of that CNN confrontation would soon be studied as a textbook example of how rigorous preparation, moral clarity, and real-world experience can outshine even the most established authority. It reminded the country of a timeless truth in a healthy democracy. Ideas should win on merit, not on the credentials of those who voice them. And as the national voting rights debate continued, one fact remained undeniable. A new fearless voice had entered the arena, proving that the most powerful response to arrogance isn't anger, but being better prepared, more informed, and unafraid to stand your ground. If you found this deep dive on the Crockett-Dershowitz showdown inspiring, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and tap the bell icon for more in-depth breakdowns of the political moments shaping America's future. Stay tuned as we bring you stories of rising voices redefining truth, power, and leadership in today's democracy.